We'll welcome everyone to the 8th and final of the Riichi Nomi New York City guest lectures, the official ones. This is the last official lecture that we're going to run. It has been a great run, and I want to thank you all for coming and hope that you enjoy this final presentation. With our usual lecture format, our lecture is screen sharing the slide deck, is going to be going through content. So please keep yourself on mute unless you really have a question. And then if you want to ask, you can either tag me or Zach in chat, or you can unmute yourself to ask directly. Zach's what would you do's kind of like examples to weigh in on are going to be at the end, so you can do the usual ampersands join to be picked on to answer those when they come up, or again, bring yourself off mute just to weigh in directly. Finally, as always, with our Riichi Nomi behavior guidelines, we're not going to be making any hateful comments. We're not going to be making any rude comments. We're all going to have fun and be friends. Now, so that others can enjoy these lectures later, they are going to be recorded and posted up on the Riichi Nomi YouTube channel, including any audience participation, so just as a note. All right. Well, without any further ado, we can go ahead and get started. So I'm introducing our lecturer tonight, who is Zach. Zach is here from the Seattle Riichi Mahjong Club, our only presenter from the West Coast, so thank you, Zach. And he has been playing Mahjong for 10 whole years. A fun fact about Zach is that he self-published a fan-made Toho card game before. I know a lot of Toho fans are here, so you should ask him about that after the lecture. Zach is used to teaching Mahjong at SoccerCon. He ran the Mahjong room there for over 7 years. Some experience presenting Mahjong topics, so this should just be great. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, Zach.
Thanks. All right, so this lecture started from, when I was asked to pick a topic, I was thinking about what interested me recently about, like, thinking about Mahjong. And one of the things that I was thinking was, like, how to play defensively when nothing looks safe. Like, most people already know general guidelines on what to do when following your reach and stuff like that. But, like, the stuff that was interesting me is reading past that, getting into the, like, 70% safe tiles, or maybe even the 60, 50% safe tiles, trying to read into your opponent's hands, doing a real, Akagi mind meld stuff. But when I came to putting together the lecture, a lot of that stuff relied on basic defensive fundamentals and concepts and terminology that really you can't skip. So a majority of the lecture ended up being basic defensive play and concepts, and then maybe at the end get into some of that voodoo stuff, just for just for kicks at the end to see if there's a way to go beyond just flat out bailing, particularly when you're trying to push. But anyway, let's get started so that we can go over the basic concepts of defensive play. This is a repurposed slideshow, or I should say, I threw this together from some slideshows that I had from SoccerCon. So I apologize now if this looks a little bad. I got a lot of the screenshots and material from this URL. It's mostly in Japanese, so I will be translating that. But these concepts don't, the screenshots are of tiles, so other than the labels, you should be able to figure out what I'm talking about. All right, so the first concept to talk about is suji. This is a word that gets thrown around a lot, and sometimes people use it to mean a lot of different things. So, the first question is, what is suji itself? So suji really just refers to any tiles that are 3 apart from each other. So 1 and 4, or 4 and 7, 2 and 5, or 5 and 8, 3, 6, and then 6 and 9. Those represent, those form 6 different suji. So these are all the suji that exist. And those are important because they represent the two sides of a two-sided weight. They talk about suji a lot, especially when talking about two-sided weights in Japanese. So they give them names for these particular weights based off of the terminology they use in Japan on the tiles. This uses the Chinese imported naming scheme. So Isu Chi is the 147, and similarly Dianu Pa and Saburo Q. In particular, when talking about suji, instead of saying san, they use saburo for the 3-6. So it could be a saburo or a roku, or saburo kyu would be all three sides. So why is suji important? So this is when playing defensively, you're trying to predict what your opponent is doing, and players tend to choose weights that give them the most possible live tiles. So that usually ends up being the ganmen, or two-sided weight. So this is basic tile efficiency 101. So the reason why suji are important for defensive play is, supposing someone has a discard pile like this, and then they reach. If the player were waiting with these tenpai hands, where they're waiting on the 2 or the 5 because they have a 3-4 in their hand, or they have a 6-7 in their hand, they're waiting on the 5 or the 8, because that 5 is in the discard pile, that would put them in furry 10. Now, it's not saying that doesn't happen, but the important part is, because they're in furry 10, they can't win off of your tile, even if it is the winning tile. The important thing to keep in mind is that sometimes players will use this information about safe discards against you and deliberately wait on a tile that you think is safe because of suji, because they are not on the two-sided weight. There are a couple of patterns that are frequent where this can show up, that you should just be careful of. Suppose this is your hand at Ishan 10. These are the tiles that you could use to get into tenpai. This is a very common sort of pattern where you're on a 1-3-5, so you have a two-sided weight to get into tenpai in that shape, waiting on the 2 or the 4. And then this double pair shape, so they can either get the 8 or the west to get into tenpai. If from this hand you drew another west, well, now you're in tenpai. What would you normally discard? Well, it seems like the obvious choice would be, it seemed like it's either but players will usually, in this case, because it doesn't change the yaku or the point value of the hand in any way, they would discard the 5 when they're done going into tenpai, because this creates a suji trap waiting on the 2. It's not the only pattern that can generate this kind of thing. Obviously, anything with tanki weight or double pair weights, those kinds of things can happen, but this is a pattern that shows up more frequently, especially when that 5 comes out late. All right, so I was talking about tricking people into suji weights. This is the most straightforward form of using suji for defensive play. It's the Omote suji, or the front, or the facing suji. This is based on a middle tile discard. The suji to that tile, so once again, plus or minus 3, is going to be generally a safer tile to discard, because since the middle tile was discarded, there are two-sided weights that they could not have in order to be in tenpai and not be in free ten. So if someone discarded the 4, the 1 and the 7 are safer. The 1 is particularly safe because the only way they could be waiting on the 1, since the 1 can only be incorporated into a two-sided weight with the 2-3, or as pairs, or as a triplet. So if they're waiting on the 1 at all, which is still possible, depending on what else has been discarded, their weight is generally going to be bad. And that's the whole idea behind this sort of defensive play, is you're banking on your opponent not deliberately choosing or not somehow maneuvering themselves into a bad weight. The 7 is slightly less safe than the 1, because the 7 can be incorporated into a pair of 7s, a triplet of 7s, or a 6, 7, 8 shape, or a 8, 9 shape waiting on the 7. So there are many more ways that the 7 can be incorporated, but many fewer ways that the 1 can be incorporated. Similarly, for the 5, the suji for the 5 is the 2 and the 8. And the 2 and the 8 have the same sort of danger as the 7 in the previous example, where there are many different ways that they could be used. For instance, like in the previous example, they could be on a 1-3 weight waiting on the 2. But they are still safer than just random tiles, because players are less likely to discard the 5 and then wait on a single tile weight. 6 is the inverse of the 4, so it's going to be coming down from the top. The 9 is the safer tile because it's on the edge, and then the 3 is a little safer, but not quite. So this is the basic suji. When people often say, I'm playing suji, they're talking about omote suji. They're playing the tile that is safe because it's 3 away from a middle tile that was discarded. The 1 and the 9, once again, are particularly safe, especially if you can see if a 9 had previously been dropped, or 2 9s had previously been dropped, and the 6 is in the player's discard pile. They can't get a triplet of 9s. The only way they could be waiting on a 9 is if it's the like a tanki weight, just a single tile weight for the 9, and they're hell waiting on. That's highly unlikely, and that's really what you're banking on. So nakasuji are another way of getting pretty safe tiles. This is like the inverse of the omote suji. So it's when a tile has both sujis to that tile have been discarded. So if the 1 and the 7 in the top row example are in the discard pile, then the 4 is a lot safer, because there's no way to wait on the 4 with a two-sided weight and not be in free 10. So both of the two-sided weights that would incorporate the 4 are locked out in that case. Similarly, on the 2-5-8 weight, if the 2 and the 8 are out, the 5 is a lot safer. If the 3 and the 9 are out, and the middle tile is a lot safer. This is almost even a little bit safer than the other sides of the Omote suji because there's no edge weights that can incorporate a 4, 5, 6. The only way that you would have a 1 and a 7 discarded and be waiting on the 4 is if you were on a 3, 5 weight and you had, or if you had a pair of 4s or something like that, and those were enabling you to use that 4 in your hand and still be waiting on the 4. Once again, sometimes it happens, but we're not banking on guaranteed safe. We're trying to get mostly safe. So kata suji or half suji, this is a way that some people misinterpret what a safe tile is. It is a tile that is, if an edge tile is discarded, but not the other corresponding tile for the inside suji, that makes the 4 a little bit safer, but it's not actually safe because there's still a two-sided weight that can incorporate the 4. So even though there is a two-sided weight that has been eliminated, you haven't eliminated all the possibilities, and actually it's fairly common to have a 1 in a discard pile and then still be on a high Manzu weight, for instance, that incorporates the 4 or the 7. So this is kind of a trap for people who just started learning suji to think like, oh, the 2 is discarded, that means the 5 is more safe. Not actually. All right, so suji is also used in Japanese terminology to refer to tiles that are not just safe tiles, but dangerous tiles. Right, so I'm going to call these dangerous suji. The first example of this is urasuji, which is if a tile is in a player's discard pile, if you shift that tile by 1, that suji, that tile and the suji to that tile are its urasuji. And the reason why this is important is imagine you're building your hand and you have this shape in your hand. What are you going to cut? Well, you might keep it for a while, but pretty soon you're going to get rid of the 1 because the 1 is superfluous. Like, it's not helping increase the number of tiles you can accept into your hand. So you cut the 1. So that's in your discard pile now. And then the 3, 4 is now in your hand, meaning that you're waiting on the 2, 5. So that's from the perspective of tile efficiency. You don't get to see that from the other player's perspective. They just see the 1 is discarded. But that 1 is actually kind of a signal. It's not guaranteeing that they had this 1, 3, 4 shape, but it is more likely that they had this kind of shape in their hand because the 1 came out. So the 2 and the 5, in this case, are the urasuji of the 1 pin, and they are more dangerous than just a random, completely unknown tile. So if you're just choosing, like, I have absolutely no safe tiles or whatever, you can at least try to steer away from discarding tiles that are urasuji to these discarded tiles, especially if these come out sort of like mid to early, because that's usually when these shapes develop. It's like somewhere near the end of the first row, middle of the second row, after you've gotten rid of your honor tiles, or sometimes even before you get rid of the honor tiles. If you started with that shape in your hand, you might cut the 1 early because you're trying, it's like a sakigiri, right? You're trying to get rid of it before the 1 becomes dangerous, and you're holding on to the safer honor tiles until later. So particularly the 1, 2, 8, 9, those are stronger indicators of urasuji. And just remember, they are more dangerous than other tiles. So there are 9 different urasuji patterns. So in this case, the red is the discarded tile, and the blue tiles that are indicated, those are the urasuji to that tile. And you can imagine if you look at this, what the shape was in someone's hand before they discarded the tile, right? So in the first case, if they had a 1, 3, 4, likely to cut the 1. If you had a 2, 4, 5, you're likely to cut the 2. The middle ones are less likely to come out early because they're the kinds of shapes that people tend to build into their hand and then cut when they've locked in their 4 or 5 strong patterns, right? But if they come out late, that could be an even stronger indicator that those tiles next to it are dangerous. In particular, like if someone reaches on one of these tiles, this is why the tile that is a neighbor to a reach tile is particularly dangerous, right? Like you don't want to play the same suit because you can imagine the shape of their hand before that. Urasuji tend to come out a little bit earlier, but it could come out right at the end depending on what the shape of their hand was. So here's another concept is Aida yonken, which is a 4-tile gap. So this is a pattern where somebody discards tiles where both of the tiles are the same urasuji, which is, in other words, there are 4 tiles. You can create a 4-tile block between the 2 discards. So in this example, you see that both the urasuji for a 1 mon and the urasuji for a 6 mon, they have the same urasuji, which is this 2-5 weight. And so if the 1 and 6 are in the discard pile, this makes the 4-tile gap shape. And so it's a little difficult to understand what's going on just by looking at this this diagram. So I think I made an example. Imagine you had this shape in your hand while you're building your hand. This is a pretty good cluster of tiles in the same suit. So you'd probably hold on to them for a while, hoping to fill in some of the gaps. Like if you draw a 2-pin, now you can have this 4-6 that can still work. Similar, if you draw a 5-pin, you can have this 1-3 that still accepts tiles. But at some point, you end up cutting that 1, and now you have this 3-4-6 shape. And then you fill in your other suits somehow, and then you get rid of the 6. Now you're on the sort of platonic 2-sided weight. And this happens pretty frequently when you're just building your normal Pinfu-esque hands, just going from tile efficiency. So in both of these cases, the 2 and the 5 are the tiles that would help fill that out. So these are extra spicy urasuji. This is basically the way you want to think about it. It is even more dangerous than just a normal urasuji. If I go all the way back to just show like the different shapes here, another way to think about it is like if people have isuchi, like if they have 1, 4s, and 7s in the discard pile, and they have 3, 6, and 9s in the discard pile, but they don't have any 2, 5, 8s, you might not know exactly which side they're on, but it is likely until some of these tiles come out, like that these are the tiles that they're waiting for. Even if a bunch of, like they could have a ton of tiles in the same suit discarded. The fact that all these tiles from the same suit are discarded means nothing if there are no tiles in the 2, 5, 8 shape in the discard pile, particularly the 5. So that's a red flag. That the Aida yonken, red flag. There are only 4 shapes for this because it does require the overlap of 2 urasujis, and there is no 4-tile gap if a 5 is discarded. It's because there's no other side of the urasujis for a 5. All right, Matagi suji, or the straddle suji. So this is when you have a tile that's discarded. The Matagi suji for that are a suji that straddle the tile that was discarded. This diagram hopefully makes that make a lot more sense. If the 4 is the tile that was discarded, there are 2 Matagi sujis for the 4. The tiles would be a 2-5 or a 3-6. All right, so why is Matagi suji important? What does it mean? It is common to have a shape like this in your hand. So you have this 3-3-4. You would typically keep that, and you might keep that for a while because, once again, tile efficiency 101, you're trying to increase the number of tiles that you could accept into your hand and move closer to tenpai. And this would let you, take 2 and the 5, but also take the 3 pin and maybe other things depending on what else is in your hand. As you get closer to tenpai, or in particular, as you draw your last tile into tenpai, what are you going to cut from this shape to go into tenpai? I mean, you're going to cut the 3 pin, right? Because you want the beautiful 2-sided weight. So if this tile is discarded, particularly very late, like the 2-5, super dangerous, right? Like that's another sign. It's like I went from this typical tile efficiency building shape, and now I'm waiting on this 2-sided weight. So these are the Matagi sujis, or these are 2 of the Matagi sujis for the discarded 3. They're especially discarded when they are like either the tiles right before the reach tile or the tile that a player reaches on. So this is another reason why you see the 3 plus or minus 1. Those are going to be Matagi suji for the 3. All right, next concept, Kabe. Kabe actually just means wall, but because the term wall means something else when we're talking about Mahjong in English, I'm going to call it a firewall because that's what it's doing. It's blocking things off. It's impenetrable. So Kabe is when 4 of a tile are accounted for, which means from your perspective, you can see all 4 of those tiles. It creates this wall or firewall that cuts off potential weights. It also cuts off potential ways that a player could build their hand to get those weights. So let's think of all the tiles that you can account for. Well, obviously you can see the tiles that are in the discard pile. You can also see tiles that people were called. This is something that sometimes people forget to look in the corner, and they'll get their beautiful 7-9 weight and forget that somebody conned the 8s. You can also see the tiles in your own hand. That's very important. And the Dora indicators. That's the one that sometimes sneaks people by because, it's just sitting out there. So, here's a good example. You see here, there was a con of 8s. So this creates a Kabe, or wall, that's going to cut off a lot of the tiles in the upper manzu. So there are fewer 2-sided weights that can be made using the upper. Like obviously, no one's going to have a 7-8 waiting on a 6-9. And it also makes it harder for people to wait on things if that incorporates the 8, because now a 6-7 manzu is kind of effectively an edge weight. Half of your tiles fully are gone. And not only that, but it's like the half that are more likely to come out, because on a 6-8 weight, the 5 is more likely to be incorporated into someone else's shape. So having those 8s gone is even worse than just not knowing where they are. There's also a pon of 3 pin, and that doesn't make a complete wall because there's a fourth 3 that could be out there. You don't know where it is. So in that case, somebody could still have a 2-3 in their hand and be waiting on a 1 or a 4. Or they could still be waiting like a 4-5 waiting on the 3 or the 6 and think it could come out. We don't know where it is. But the tiles that the 3 cut off are considerably safer than just random tiles, right? So the 1 pin and the 2 pin, those are a lot harder to incorporate into people's hands since the 3s were called. Here's another example. There's a Kabe formed here. I don't know if you can see it, but the 5 pin, 5 pin, 5 pin, and the Dora indicator 5 pin. So all the 5s actually have been accounted for. And that middle Kabe actually makes Pinzu just in general a lot harder to work with because you know, people often either wait on the 5 or they try to incorporate the 5 into a shape. The fact that it's the Dora indicator makes it even that much more unfortunate for people because they want to try to use the 6 in their hand. Not in this case, obviously, because a lot of people are bailing and that 6 came out early. But you know, from this player's perspective, they're like, okay, well, the 6-7 weight, well, it's pretty much gone. There's nothing we can do about that because of this Kabe of the 5s. So, Kabe suji. So these are tiles that have been made more safe because players can't make a 2-sided weight due to the Kabe. So it's very obvious when you look at the 2-so. If all 4 2s are out, no one can be on 2-3 weight. So the 1 is super safe. It has been walled off by the 2s. If the 3 has been, all 4 3s are gone, then 1s and 2s are both a lot safer because you can't have a 3-4, you can't have a 2-3. So the only way you could be waiting on the 1 or the 2 is if it's a pair weight or a tonki weight. The 4, now the 4, when all the 4s are gone, the 2 and the 3 are the suji for the 4, but not the 1. And so, like, why is that? Well, somebody could have been on a 2-sided weight before all the 4s were binned, right? They could have the 2-3 in their hand, and then the 4s are gone, but they're not going to change their weight yet. They're like, well, I still have got one side of this 2-sided weight. So the 2s and the 3s, unless someone has a 1-3 weight and they're waiting on the 2, or a 1-2 weight, like in these kanchan, penchan weights that people try to avoid, they're not going to be waiting on those tiles. A Kabe of 5s is a little weird because there's still so much space on either side that players can use. They could have a 2-3 side, a 2-3 weight, and still be waiting on either side of that, right, for the 1-4, or a 7-8 waiting on the 6-9. Or before all the 5s got binned, they could have had a 3-4 weight and be waiting on a 2-5, and then all the 5s are gone, but they're still waiting on the 2. So that's why the Kabe of 5s only makes the tile that's 2 less and 2 more slightly safer, because the only way that players would be waiting on those is if they had the kanchan penchan weight. And then once again, the top going down is the same as the bottom going up, just reverse. Come out from the edge. Tiles towards the edge, more safe. Tiles on the other side are still fair game. I don't know why that didn't pop up until the end. All right, whatever. So partial Kabe. I mentioned this with the pawn of 3s. So that's the leaky wall. It's when only 3 tiles are accounted for. You can sometimes treat it like a full Kabe, but it's much less safe. It's like, if you had to just pick, particularly like, if there's a pawn of twos, people are less likely to go for that one. They're less likely to try to wait for it. They're less likely to incorporate it. They could have already had that shape in their hand before the pawn happened. It's one of those things where it's like, you're calculating the odds in your head, like, what are the chances that so-and-so that just reached has the last 2 pin? Are you willing to take that risk? It might be worth, if that lets you build your hand. You're like, I've got this 1 pin. This 1 pin is worthless for me. That pawn of twos, there's no way I can incorporate it in my hand. I need to cut this to get into tenpai. But it can get you sometimes also. So a double partial Kabe. This is where you have 2 side-by-side Kabe. And that makes it like way more safe than if it's just 1. Because let's suppose like these tiles are in someone's discard, or like just account for across all the discard piles and your hand and the door indicator and whatnot. And then your opponent reaches. And so what are they waiting on? If you draw this 9 pin, is that safe? Well, in order for them to wait on the 9 pin and have, like, there's only 2 options. One is a Tanki wait, and they're on a hell wait for just that 9 pin. The other is that they have this 7-8 shape. But they would have to have both the last 8 and the last 7. And they couldn't have the pair of 9s waiting on the last 9. So it's like, this is highly unlikely. I would take bets that they are not on this 7-8 shape. I've lost that bet. But if you're trying to push your hand, in particular, against a reach, and you don't just want to, like, full bail, this kind of shape is, I would say, like, 90% safe. Maybe more. All right. Dora have a huge impact on which tiles are safe and not safe. And that is because players tend to try to jam Dora into their hands even if it means poor tile efficiency. And this is because you're calculating not just how many tiles can I draw to get into tenpai, but also, like, what is the EV of my hand? Like, how many points am I expecting to win? And if it's below a Mangan, well, I mean, first off, trying to get a Mangan without Dora is hard. And if it's below, then basically every Dora is going to double your points. So if you're cutting your weights in half and doubling your points, you're kind of breaking even. On the other hand, you might draw more Dora because having Dora in your hand makes it easier to accept even more Dora into your hand. Or players might discard them early because they realize there's no way to incorporate it in their hand, and they don't want to be stuck with a dangerous tile later when someone reaches. So there's a lot to be read around Dora in terms of which tiles are safe, which tiles are dangerous, and what discarded from someone's hand. And this extends to the entire suit that the Dora is in. And this is assuming, in a lot of cases, that we're talking about a suited Dora tile. Honor Dora have a different set of considerations, but they're also a lot more straightforward. The biggest takeaways: don't rely on suji when it comes to tiles in the Dora suit or near the Dora. So let's suppose, like, this is the dead wall, and we have the door indicator with the 3-pin. This is sort of like the relative safetiness of the tiles in that suit. For the Dora itself, usually super dangerous. The tiles that are suji to the Dora are also quite dangerous because I could be building my hand, right? And I don't have any Dora, but I have the tile that's next to the Dora Soba, right? I'm going to keep that in my hand because if I then later draw a Dora, I can incorporate both of those tiles and then be on a wait, right? it is very common for players to end up with these shapes where one of the sides is the Dora. Right? They'll go for that weight, that two-sided weight. But once you get more than 3 tiles away from the Dora, those tiles are safe again. In fact, they're almost, depending on what else the player has discarded, they're almost a little safer because they're like, why am I going to bother with this 6, 7 weight when the Dora is the 4, right? The 5 is less likely to come out. Now, it's going to happen, right? It's like, it doesn't make them like any safer than a completely unknown tile, but they're certainly less influenced by the fact that the Dora is in suit. All right, so consider this is the dead wall again. These are some of the weights that a player might have. You have to just consider these when someone reaches and you don't have any information to contradict this. They could be on a Tonki weight for the Dora. They could have one Dora in their hand and then have this Kanchan shape where it's an inside weight, including one of the Dora. Or they could have this shape where they're just waiting for the Dora itself. They could obviously have a two-sided weight where one of the sides is the Dora. Or they could have this two-way weight that uses the Dora in their hand. Or they could have a pair of Dora and a pair of other tiles and be waiting on the Dora itself. Like, players will, maybe not at the same rate, but they will often choose these kinds of shapes just because that's the Dora and end up in these weights. So, pardon me. Just like the tile that is right next to the reach tile is dangerous, the tile that is right next to the Dora is also dangerous. So what does it mean if a player cuts a Dora from their hand? One of the obvious things is that they could be in Tenpai or close. This is like if you're building plain, simple Pinfu tile efficiency hands, you will often keep a Dora, just a lone Dora by itself, in your hand, hoping that you can maybe draw and change one of your shapes to incorporate that Dora. But when you have your, 5 blocks get locked in, and you're in Tenpai, and you have to discard into Tenpai, if that Dora can't be used anymore, that's when it comes out, right? Especially if you're playing against people who are either in a position to Damaten or they like Damaten. Seeing that Dora comes out, you might take a moment and consider, are they now in Tenpai? Now, because the Dora came out, their hand is probably worth a little bit less, right? It is less likely for players to cut Dora and still have a bunch of Dora in their hand. Obviously, the exception can be made if you're playing in a rule set that has red 5s, because you never know with red 5s. So be careful for Damaten hands once if you see just a random Dora come out, especially like it came out from their hand. This is one of those cases where seeing when a player discards if it came from inside their hand or if it was the tile that they drew is important, because if it comes from inside their hand, it has meaning. If they just drew it and discarded it, it still has a little bit of meaning, but less. Another thing that the Dora can mean is like that player was giving up on trying to incorporate that Dora on that hand, which often means it's like they would have to like it has nothing to do, like the Dora has nothing to do with the other shapes of their hand, or they're cutting the Dora to choose the better weight over the more expensive points. Nearby tiles to that the Dora in that suit are ostensibly a little bit safer if they discard the Dora. You might not want to discard directly an Ura Suji to that Dora that came out. But you might move towards the edges, towards the 1 or 9, and feel more confident that those tiles will go through than just random unknown tiles. Another thing, particularly if the tiles came out early, is that players going for a weirdo hand, for lack of a better term. They're going for something that's like a hand that's worth a lot of points, or that has a very particular shape. Most common with like a honitsu or chinitsu shape, like people will sakigiri. They will do an early cut of Dora because they're like, I don't want to be stuck with this and then have my chinitsu shape plus this Dora in another suit, right? That's not good for anyone, especially if they're like discarding all the other tiles, and then that puts them in free 10. So kind of just like, this is a red flag. If you see people cutting Dora, expect that they're doing something weird, shenanigans, stuff is up.
Zach, we actually have a question in the chat. If someone reaches on the Dora, what does that mean in terms of safety for the rest of the suit?
All right, well, here's an example. Somebody reached on the Dora in this case. What can we tell from this particular screenshot? This was the first tile that came out from that suit, but it was also super early. And, well, sorry, it's not the first tile of the suit. It's the, it was the Dora, but they hadn't discarded a lot of tiles of other suits. This often means that players are not waiting on that suit. Not guaranteed, but if you could somehow incorporate that 6 into your hand, players are more likely to hold on to it. Even if it makes their wait a little worse. And then we see, like, this is with the hands turned on. This shows what the player's actual weight was. Right, so you can see the fact that the Dora came out so early in this thing, and it was the tile they discarded when they reached. Once again, we're kind of trying to read into the matrix here, but I would consider, in general, other Pinzu to be a lot safer, because the way I read this particular development, especially so early on, is they were holding on to the Dora hoping that they could use it. They found out that they couldn't use it, and so they cut it as a reach. I sometimes say, like, this tile is never coming out of my hand, but if it is, it's coming out sideways. It's basically like, this is a dangerous tile to other people, and I don't want them to have it. I don't want them to be able to call it or use it. But if I get to the point where I'm going to reach, I'll do it. I'm going to jam it. And you can see that happens quite often. Would I still be scared to toss something like the 5-pin in that situation? I wouldn't toss a 5-pin into the E-pots. So this is, once again, when you're looking at safe tiles, usually the safety like runs towards the outside. So because this is the 6, the outside for that is 7, 8, 9. I would feel a lot safer cutting a 7-pin for this 6 than I would cutting a 5-pin, because there's no two-sided weight that would incorporate the 7-pin that you would imagine could not be made better by just keeping the 6. I'm not saying it doesn't ever happen, but you could imagine if they had a 3-4-6 in their hand, that they decided, well, I'm going to make up the fact that I'm losing a point, I'm losing a Han from cutting the Dora by getting this two-sided weight, and I'm getting reach, so I'm more likely to draw it myself. So you're also counting a better chance you're EVing a little bit of the sumo value. maybe slightly better to cut the 6. So the 5 still isn't like 100% safe, but I think the 5 pin is a lot safer than just like a 5 so, for instance, because they haven't discarded any sozu. And it's much more likely that they cut the 6 just because they could not use it at all than they cut the 6 because they're going for a slightly more efficient weight. So once again, let's go back to tile efficiency. Let's suppose this is the shape of your hand. In a normal case, if you get into tenpai, what are you going to cut? You're going to cut the 2 to go on a 2-sided weight. That's pretty typical. So this is why the ura and Matagi suji are dangerous, right? So you cut this for a 2-sided weight. But if this were the Dora indicator, now where are you going to cut to go into tenpai? I think most people would usually cut the 3. Well, now once again, not 100% of the time. They might have a mangan without the extra point from the Dora. But in most cases, you're kind of struggling to get there. And this lets you not only wait on the Dora, but also wait on this completely random tile and still use the Dora on your hand. And also, you don't have to put that Dora out there for other people to take, right? So you're keeping the dangerous tiles in your hand, and you're increasing the possible value of your hand by using the Dora and being able to accept more Dora. So this kind of shape, this is the great example of lower in terms of just actual win percentage, but way higher on EV. And so people will often do this, even though it's the same shape as before, right? So that's why Dora mess up the readings, particularly with suji and stuff like that. It's also to remember red 5s of Dora as well. So anytime you're playing a game that has red 5s, the middle tiles are more likely to get junked up in people's hands. Not just the 5, but also the 4 and 6, and to a lesser extent the 3 and 7, because players are holding on to them either because they have a red 5 or because they hope to draw a red 5 and incorporate it into their hand. And once again, the suji to the Doras are more dangerous. So anytime you have red 5s, 2s and 8s become slightly, not dramatically, but slightly more dangerous as well, just in terms of completely random unknown tiles, as players are trying to choose the weights that allow them to wait on those red 5s, right? So you can imagine if you had this sort of super penfu, you have 6 blocks in your hand, and you have to choose a block to cut. Are you going to cut the 3-4 from your hand, or are you going to cut the 4-5 that doesn't have a red 5? Well, it's that the 4-5 doesn't have a red 5, but the 3-4, it might have a red 5. You just got to draw it. All right, so this is the last section, and you'll have to apologize if this is a very hand-wavy section, but there are some things that you can do to try to infer from people's hands stuff that isn't explicitly suji or genbutsu or discarded tiles, like absolutely guaranteed safe tiles. And yeah, basically to sum it up, maybe I'm reading too much into this, can also come back and bite you. So basically, we're trying to guess how an opponent's hand developed on pure conjecture, just based off of looking at their discards. So one of the ways of doing this is looking at their early discards. So for instance, if a player cuts a 3 or a 7 very early, setting aside Kabe and everything else, it makes the 1 and 2, or for the 7, the 8 and 9, a lot safer against that player. And the reason is the shape that your hand is typically in when you cut a 3, particularly if that's like the first suit, the first tile of that suit that comes out, is the 3 is not helping at all, right? And in order to wait on a 1 or 2, they would have to have a 3 in their hand, unless they're on a bad weight, and we're assuming players aren't making bad weights. So sometimes a player will have a 3-3-4 or something and cut the 3 early on. That's poor tile efficiency. We're assuming players aren't playing poor tile efficiency. So even if there is no suji that indicates that the 1 and 2 are safe, if you just have to guess, like someone reached, and I don't know, but the first sozu they discarded was a 7, I'll cut the 9. Like, not guaranteed, but it's a lot safer than a random tile. If players cut 4 or more tiles from the same suit early on, they may not be going for a complete honitsu or full flush, chinitsu, but they might be getting rid of just all the tiles in that suit. Especially like you have the great mahjong luck of, I cut a 7 so as my first discard, and then I draw the 6 so, and then I draw the 8 so, or whatever, right? Cutting 4 or more tiles before cutting any other suit is usually a strong indicator, or even like if it's like maybe a couple of tiles from sozu and then like a 9-pin and then another sozu, right? Strong indication that they don't need that suit at all. It's just not in their hand. Next is if a player starts, and this is something that like it helps a lot if you see if this is cut from their hand or if this was something that was drawn and discarded. If they cut a tile that's a more middle tile and then cut a tile next to that tile that was going outward, they're either cutting that suit or they were cutting that shape from their hand. This is especially true if one of their discards was a Dora. So if I cut like, in our previous example, 3-pin was the Dora indicator. If I cut a 4-pin and then I cut a 3-pin, regardless of what else happens in the game, I think the 7-pin is a lot safer against that player. Why? Because if they had even any tiles in that suit, they're more likely to try to keep those tiles and incorporate the Dora with them. But because they're cutting those, especially if they cut it early, they're indicating that they're getting rid of those tiles because they see them as dangerous, like a liability later, which is also the like sort of red flag of maybe this person is going for a honitsu, maybe this person is going for a chinitsu, right? Or sometimes you get the, tryhards that are like, I'm going to go for chanta. But, setting that aside, another common shape that you'll see is if somebody cuts like an 8-pin and then cuts the 9-pin. That means a lot less than if they were cutting like a 5 and 6 back to back from their hand. Because if you had 5, 6, 8, 9 in your hand, you'll often get rid of the 8, 9 even early on because it's fighting for the same tile as the 5, 6. So don't read too much into it for the edge tiles coming out, but if it's the middle tiles, 4, 5, 6 that are getting cut, and then tiles that are next to it, that's usually the shape when people are trying to play defensively. Finally, if someone plays cuts a bunch of pseudo tiles before honor tiles, then that tile is probably not part of better shape. And this sort of like pairs in with the first indication. if the first discard I see someone make is like an 8-so, and then they cut some honor tiles later, I almost never hesitate cutting the 9-so. Because to me it looks like they are just getting rid of useless tiles. That's kind of what we're trying to identify is which tiles are people cutting because they're useless, they didn't connect to anything, and which tiles are people cutting because they had an efficient shape and they're going to a more efficient shape. So all that close to tenpai, efficient to more efficient, that's what the urasuji, what the Matagi suji and stuff, that's what those are for. The other tiles, those are like, I started with this random junk and I'm trying to home in on what my 5 or 6 blocks are going to look like. Finally, if a player cuts suited tiles before honor tiles, all honor tiles become slightly more dangerous. And this is because of just a way that some people build their hands, right? I'm sure you know a few people who do this, where if they have all 3 dragons in their hand, they'll just hold on to them. And they'll cut all of the other tiles that don't connect into a shape before they cut the red dragons. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Like, one is if they're hoping to draw, it's kind of like holding a 3 red dragons, or not 3 red dragons, 3 different dragon tiles, or any kind of yakuhai tile. It's like having a 3-sided weight, right? Where you only need to draw any one of those, and then you have something that you can call to get into tenpai. So if you see later on in the match, oh, this green dragon came out of someone's hand, it might be because they paired up a red dragon. So especially if you haven't seen any of the other yakuhai tiles discarded, those tiles, super sketchy. So here's another concept which is useful for fighting an open hand in particular. If somebody made a call, right? So you don't get the benefit of them telling you they're in tenpai. Like, let's suppose they're going for a very obvious open honitsu, and you're trying to play defensively around their honitsu. Any tile that the player who plays immediately before them, the player sitting to their left, discards, is way safer than other tiles, even kind of later on in the match. And that's because basically if a player is open, once they make a call, usually they're going to call whatever they can. So if they couldn't call before, until they change their hand and change their weights, they probably still can't call. So in particular, when you're fighting against open hands, it's important to see when players put tiles into their hand and when they discard the tile that they drew, right? Because you're more concerned about anything that gets them slightly closer to tenpai, or also anything that changes which tiles they could be waiting on. So this is also sort of a it decreases in its sort of utility over time, right? So if someone pwned a chun, for instance, right, and then the person to their left discards 3-pin, and they don't call it. Well, the 3-pin's pretty safe then, but if 6 turns go around, and they've changed the contents of the hand several times, you can no longer call that 3-pin super safe, because they might have, especially if you see other tiles from that suit come out, they might have changed up their weight, and so now they have the 5-6 in their hand, and they can take that 3-pin. I didn't get a chance to call it then, I can call it now. But when you're fighting against those honitsu shapes, and you don't have anything to go on, like, unless you're going to completely fold your hand and start discarding useful tiles to you. This is one thing to consider when trying to decide whether a tile is safe or not. It's like, don't discount the tiles that a player could have called if they had the option. All right. Finally, we have these sort of like last chance and exhaust tiles, which very similar to Kabe in terms of theory. But basically, if you have no way of waiting on a particular tile, or if most of them have been discarded or have been locked up by a pawn, players are very likely to just give up on that shape and change it. So for instance, let's suppose you had a 7-8 in your hand and someone pawns the 6. Do you keep that 7-8? If you have any other shape in your hand, any other 2 tiles that could form a shape, they're automatically more efficient than that 7-8 that you had. So you are likely to, maybe not right away, because that wall of 6s make the 7-8 safer. They're safe tiles for you. Discard later. But if you're trying to build with tile efficiency, you'll probably cut the 7-8 at some point. Now what we can read from that, even if I don't see you discard that 7-8, the fact that you haven't discarded the 7-8 makes it more likely that you didn't have a 7-8 to begin with. Because if you did, then you would have cut it, right? Boy, I should have advanced that before I started talking. Anyway, point is, when you see these tiles get exhausted either through partial or full walls, you can imagine how other players' hands have developed, assuming that they are behaving rationally with the same information that you. All right. Anyway, that's all that I had for slideshow stuff. So the question is, does anyone have any questions before I move on to the sort of what you do's? Was I supposed to use the whatever thing to pull out questions, or I guess you can just type it in chat or whatever?
Yeah, I'm happy to call on someone with the bot if you want to answer, or if people just want to unmute, that works for you.
Yeah. Yeah, let's call on them with the bot while I get the what would you do's set up.
All right, so someone will have some warning in advance that they're going to have to use their brain. And it's going to be B-Chen who has to use his brain, so get ready, B-Chen. B-Chen, if you're talking, I don't think we can hear you.
Yeah.
Oh, now.
That's a tough one.
Did you have a question about the lecture, or are we talking about the, like, I didn't want to move to the what would you do's yet, but did anyone have questions about any of the topics in the lecture? I kind of just steamrolled that. Okay, let's just move on to the what would you do's. All right, here you go. What would you do?
Bail.
All right, how do you bail?
That's a good question. I mean, I'd still cut the 2-pin here. You still have a decent two-sided shape, and just jam. You're not going to be able to use that 5-stone in your hand.
Yeah, no, the wall of 4 so's makes it very hard for you to use that 5 in your hand. But because that 7 came out, it is not unreasonable that the player had a 6-7-7 weight, right? For instance, right? The 5 is Matagi suji to the 7. It is not your draw yet. I think that this was right after the con, and I guess the con happened after the reach.
Ah, so yeah. So basically you have nothing. I see.
I think that the 2-pin definitely came out after the reach regardless, though. But once again, I don't know this exact situation because I didn't provide the screenshot.
So because of the hole across from me, I'm pretty sure that was just reached. So you don't have a draw tile yet.
I see.
But given that, I don't know, the 5-star doesn't seem that bad. They could have 6-7-7. I mean, I personally would still bail this hand in any way I can, but the 2-pin is obviously not safe in this case.
Right. The 2-pin is an urasuji to that 1-pin that the player had discarded. Now, they couldn't have foreseen the 4-pin becoming the door indicator for obvious reasons when that happened, but all right, let's move to the next slide, or next example. There you go. Grab me a rando.
We got Moku.
All right, let's see what we got here. A reach on the chun. And there's been no discards yet. If we are looking to bail, I mean, just immediately, I might just discard the Rion or the 1 pins just because I have 2 of them and they're on the outside, which makes them a little more safer, maybe. They discarded that 9 pin, but then again, so I guess my 7 and 6 pin are a little bit more dangerous.
So one of the things that you can see in this particular screenshot is it's highlighting which tiles came from their hand and which tiles were tsumogiri, right?
Okay, so only the 9 pin came from their hand the entire time? Is that what that means? Or is that the other way around?
The bright tiles came from their hand.
From there. Oh, that makes the most sense.
Right.
Okay,
so the first 9 pin they discarded. The second 9 pin they drew.
Oh, okay. So since they discarded that so early, I would say the 8 pin I'd probably discard. If they Sumokiri that's what I would do.
Yeah, I think.
And I have 2 7s. It's a little bit more blocked too, just because there's so many 9 pins out in the 8 pin as well.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. There's also a slight wall of 5 mons. You can see that 2 of them have been discarded and there's 1 in your hand. I think the 8 pin is way safer, but if you had to discard the 7 mon at some point, that's not the worst option.
Oh, I see.
Not the best option.
Yeah. Opin's pretty good. I might even, what are your thoughts of the 1 pin then over after you do like the 7 mon? Would that be your third discard or?
Well, it depends on
if say nothing else.
I would say setting aside the question of like absolute defense or whatever, in this case, I would be fighting for this hand, so I would try not to.
Oh, you would.
Right, because it's South 3, it's your last dealership, and you're in last place. So
Oh, that is a good point.
I might cut the 8-pin to try to not hit the E-pots, but after that, I'd probably fight for this regardless. Can't get worse than 4th.
It's true.
All right, let's get another person, please.
Taxi, you're up.
Wait, I'm muted. Okay, I'm unmuted. Let me take a look. Where are we at? No Riichis so far. 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 6, 4, 5, 6. Okay. 1, 2, 3. I would, based on this hand, pitch the 3 mon right back out. It's suji to the person across from me who's open is showing 1 Dora. Who knows how many more Dora they have. You already have 1 red 5. The person to your left, if you were paying attention to whether they're keeping tiles in their hand or not, you would have noticed the 5 get pitched right back out from their draw, so they probably don't need anything around it. And there's no Riichi on the right. Not sure whether they're in Tenpai or not. And this hand is a very, very, very valuable hand that I would not bail on for almost anything, especially if there is Kan or a Dora to be had.
Yeah, I think this
You're
is...
looking at Pinfu, Tanyo, Sanshoku, Red Dora already, and that's before any Reach or Sumo or Ura.
Yeah, I think this is a pretty straightforward push. I don't know why this got sent to me, but you know, yeah, no, I agree with everything you said. Let's get another slide in here.
All right.
This is the same hand.
This is the same
Tile
hand.
later.
1 tile later.
Wait, what? Okay, they pitched the 3.
This changes anything.
I would still discard the 3 mon here. Or the, I mean, you could potentially think that the player on your right is in Tenpai considering they've 2 sets, but I would still push this hand because it's too good. So, and the 6-so could be dangerous to the player across from you too because they haven't discarded any so they're probably going for some sort of Tanya, yet you also have the 4s in your hand, so that means they would only have to have the other one left. So yeah, right at this point I would discard the 3 mon because it's not going to play into anyone except for probably the player on your right, and you want to push this hand.
Yeah, and on the topic of the 6-so, you notice that the QW2 already discarded a 6-so,
Right.
which means that MIDI 9 had a chance at some point to call on the 6-so, and they didn't. So that makes the 6-so a little bit safer. And you also have this partial wall of 4s, which helps cut the ways that they could wait on the 6-so even more. So yeah. Also in this case, for what it's worth, you could cut a 5-so later on if things get hairy because you have that double wall where the 4-so are blocking the 5 on the bottom, the 6-so are blocking the 5 on the top. 3 of each have come out. It's not guaranteed, but it's a little safer than nothing. I don't know what this... I don't know. We're moving on to the next one.
Moko is back up.
All right, I'm back up here. Let's see.
All right, finally an E-pot situation. All right.
Oh, good, yeah. Let's see. So we don't have a particularly valuable hand, and it still leaves 3. So instead of just blindly looking at if I was going to bail, I'll say I probably will want to bail here. Let's see, we've got a lot of, we've got 2, there's a lot of the 1-so out that was discarded pretty early, so that 2-so could be kind of safe against Kamicha here. That 8-so is a little bit later, but there's 2 of them out already. No, that's still not too safe, so maybe not the 9-sos. I think I would cut the 2-so here. There's... Yeah. Does that make sense?
Pardon me. Yeah, so I'm gonna... there's definitely some discussion about the 9-so in the chat.
I like that 9-so too, though. I don't see them wait on that, so... Yeah.
I'm definitely in the 9-so camp on this one, personally, because especially since you can see here which tiles came from their hand. The 8-so was the second suited tile that they discarded. 1-so was the first one. So, like, they started on the edge. Now, the 9 is Suji to the Dora, right? So they could have been on a 7, 8, 8, but that means that they would have to have, like, one of the last 8s still in their hand as well. And be in that shape and discard basically nothing but garbage to get into Tenpai. It's very unlikely. Plus, if you discard the 9 and it's safe, well, you have 3 safe tiles and you can still hope to develop the rest of your hand. You've got a pair in these 7 pins, so, you know, maybe...
you can get a Tanya out of it or something.
Yeah, maybe in a few turns it comes around.
Yeah. All right. Oh, plus you know you're never going to draw that 1-so, so you probably are. All right, sounds good.
Okay, they've been Riichi'd for a while. It's the dealer, so you probably want to play safe, but you've already stolen, so you're kind of in a hard place. Well, they threw that 1 pin super early, and they didn't want the 5 or the 4, so you have the suji from the 5 to throw the 2 pin. But if you wanted to push... whether you throw the 6 or the 9, the 9 would be safer, I'd say. So safe decision is to, if bailing, is to throw the 2, but since you're already pushing this hand with stealing, I would throw the 9.
Yeah, Chase brought up a good point, which is if you keep the 2 pin, you would be putting yourself into a furry 10 hand here.
Oh, you're right. I overlooked that.
Even in this situation, I would feel skeptic about cutting the 9 until I got some other indicator that it is safe. Because the 5 and 4 came out after they reached, so they didn't play any factor in their decision-making process, right? And they could also have they could have another 5-4 in their hand, right? It's not even a last chance, right? They could also have a 7-8 in their hand. So it's not a whole lot of information to go on, but you do have 3 turns of other discards that people have made. I'd say obviously the 2-pin, you're right, is the safest discard, even though no other it's only suji to the 5, and the 5 came out after the reach. But because that 1 pin came out, they would have had to deliberately keep a unlikely, like, they couldn't even have a 1-3 shape, right? So they would have to keep a really bad shape to be waiting on the 2. Yeah. Anyway, cool, good. Let's see what else we have.
Taxi, you're up again.
Oh, I'm muted again. It's me. You have no safe tile. The 6 pin is more dangerous than a random tile. On the other hand, you do have 2 Yakuhai and staring at Honitsu. I would push that 6 pin.
Yeah, it looks like once again, this isn't a very good example when it comes to like defensive play. Like you're just backed up against a wall, and if we're talking about positional play, well, you would be dealing into a dealer reach.
And also you're already in last place. You can't get much more last.
You're in last place, and your dealership is still coming up. So you have a dream that you could fight for this. All right, let's take a look at this.
This is a Claire special.
And there's no one in the list, Taxi, if you want to keep talking.
Oh no. Let's see. What do I do with this hand? South 4. All you have to do is get out safely. I would pitch the 1-so and hope that they weren't on some BS weight.
I think that as far as
there's Riichi on my right too. I didn't see that.
It's 2 reach.
Oh, hang on. I didn't notice that Riichi on my right. Oh no. Oh, this is hard. Oh no. You're screwed in so many different directions. Oh no. Oh no. I would pitch the 8-so. And hope that BC Mac wasn't waiting on it, because it seems to be safe to play against the dealer, and the dealer has a 1.5 multiplier and epots.
Yeah, I think like based on this shape of tiles, one thing I want to call out is that the player on BC Mac did an early reach, and one thing about early reaches is suji means a lot less because you tend to have, like, if you get an early reach, you get whatever tenpai
it is Kabe.
were dealt. Right, so you have a partial Kabe of the 2-so, and you also have a partial Kabe of the 4-so. So I think the 2-so and the 1-so are both very safe. I would be a little more comfortable throwing the 2-so first, because it's guaranteed not epots into Luke D. But the 1-so is also pretty safe because it is an edge suji to the 4-so, and there's that wall of 2-sos. Like, BC Mac would have to have had a double pairweight kind of from the beginning of the 1-sos in order to be able to accept it into their hand. But in order to accept the 2-so into their hand, they would have to be on like a 1-3 weight, right? And they would have to have a 1-3 weight that they chose to reach on, despite the fact that 2 of them were already gone at the start of the match before they reached. Like, let me deliberately 4th turn reach on something that there's only 2 tiles left. Doesn't seem likely. I also like your 8-so call here, based on, like, there's a full Kabe of 6-so, right? So you can see that in order to use the 8-so in their hand, they would have to have a pair of 8-so in their hand, or they would have to, like, have a 7-9 weight. But you can see, like, 2 of the 7s are already out, 2 of the 9s are already out. So, like, the chance of having those in their hand and, like, from the beginning, much less. The 6-7 discards from the dealer, Luke D. This is what I was saying earlier, when you start with a middle tile and then you discard a tile more towards the outside. It's an indicator that they were not trying for this shape. Either the 6-so came from their hand, and then they drew the 7 and they're like, this is useless, I just discarded that 6. Either way, it's highly unlikely that that came from a fruitful shape. And the full Kabe of 6 by this point makes that 8 super safe. Yeah, I think that obviously the tune is kind of a trap here. Like, you have many more safe options. In fact, once that 2 comes out, because of the Kabe of 4s and the Kabe of 6s, the 5-so is also super safe. Like, this would probably turn into a match where everybody discards all of their Sozu until they're left with nothing but dangerous tile.
Oh, am I still the only one?
Brave people, we're out of volunteers to answer questions, so go ahead and join the list.
Oh, Bichan.
Thank you, Bichan.
Whoops, muted. Amazing. Well, one says Kabe, so that's about as good as you got, even though it's a Dora. But they're early reaches, so I don't think you have anything better here.
I'd agree on that ESO.
Same. And unfortunately, most of the other tiles that you could...
Oh my god! 3rd turn?
2 3rd turn reaches.
There's a Moku posted the spoiler of what Shimocha has. How do you get that 3rd turn?
Sometimes you just get dealt those tiles. It was an interesting choice on their part to...
For posterity, I guess, for the recording, Shimacha is in Tenpai for Kokushimuso.
with a reach. Yeah, so I guess that that Haku is pure death. Cool. All right. Well, was this the? Oh no, this was the scrap. Let's grab someone to talk about this one.
Prince Talio, you're up again.
All right, Riichi. Oh wow, 2 Riichis in a row. Okay. 3 is Dora. I wanted to look to the 2 pin, but then it's very dangerous. Even though they discarded the 1 pin early on the right, they haven't discarded any other circles, so it's still scary. But you don't. When did they? I guess it would depend on when they made that con and the 2 pin became Dora. But well, someone discarded the 5 pin earlier. Honestly, I think 2 pin might actually not be that bad, considering all the early 1 pin drops by both players and the 3 pin drop soon after by the player across from you.
All right, so I want to bring up a topic that was discussed earlier, which is the Urasuji, right? So if your opening hand is 1, 3, 4 pin, what are you going to cut?
The 1.
Right. So like the person who cut the 3 pin, the 2 pin I would say is a lot safer if they have both a 1 and 3 in the discard early on. But the North player here, much less so, right? It is highly plausible that they could be waiting on a 2.
Right.
There aren't very many 3s or 4s out or accounted for. And not only that, but it is the Dora. Now, they couldn't have necessarily counted on that being Dora in their hand when they built it, but sort of the corollary to that is if somehow you can maneuver into having a functional hand with this, not just playing defensively, like you have Tanyao Dora 4.
Oh, right. You
Dora
would push
5.
this. Yeah. I was totally in safety mode.
So in this case, I would probably like clench and discard the 1-so because if the 1-so gets out and it's safe, that makes the 4-so that much safer, and you're going to want to discard the 1-so and the 4-so in order to get into Tenpai anyway. And I might just try to call if the opportunity presents itself. And there's not a lot here to look at in terms of things like Kabe or early discards that can help with the tiles that you have in your hand, right? At least not against both of the reaches. Like the 3-4 looks like it might be a little bit safer because of that super early 5-mon drop, but not a whole lot safer. And it's not safe at all against the person sitting across from you. So,
no, yeah, I totally agree. I completely just overlooked the fact that you had Tanya Dora's 5 actually. So yeah, totally push this hand, discarding the 1-so.
and I think that's back to the first. Yeah, we're back to the beginning. All right. Well, anyway, that's all I had for the what would you do's.
We actually have a question, Zach, from Chase about that last example that you had up before with all those Dora, asking if the Forso came out after, if you would chi, like if you would call it, or pawn it, I guess, whichever, depending on what you do. Pawn.
I would say if someone discarded a Forso and I had the opportunity to call it, in this case I would. Because that would create because the tiles that you need to cut to get into Tenpai after calling the Forso are on the outside, they are safer to discard than if, say, the shape were inverted and it was like 4-4-5. So if a 4-4-5 came out, then I would not call the 4s. Or sorry, if I had a 4-4-5 in my hand, I would not call the 4s and cut the 5. I would just say, great, now 4-so is definitely safe. I'll call a 2 or 5-so to get into Tenpai, or a 2 or 5 mon to get into Tenpai. But in that case, it would be like confirming safe tiles as opposed to snapping it off to get the quick win. All right. Well, anyway, that's all I had for my presentation. I hope that was useful to some people, if nothing else, explaining some of the terminology that you might have heard thrown around, and now you can see what it's actually referring to.
Zach, I definitely want to thank you so much. This was an awesome presentation, and I feel very relieved that you lived up to all of my expectations, even though you said at the beginning that you wouldn't. This was really great. If anyone has any additional questions for Zach, I think you can feel free to ping him in this channel or reach out to him via Discord. Otherwise, if you ever deal in while trying to fold again, you can go ahead and hold him personally responsible. So that's another great part of this lecture. Now, this was our final official Mahjong strategy lecture. So I'm expecting big increases in our Riichi out scores this month. We've had 8 now, and I did want to announce as a final treat to ourselves for running lecture on emote use strategy in Maj Soul. So Moku from Boston has an excellent presentation on, like which emotes to pick, how to chain your emotes, thinking a couple emotes in advance. So that extremely important topic will be next week if anyone wants to stop by and learn more about the emotes they can use. Otherwise, I hope that you enjoyed these lectures. I hope you learned at least 1 or 2 things. We're going to be working to get them all up on YouTube in the coming weeks. I know that there has been some backlog. That's because we've been very busy with work, but we're going to work to get those all up and make the slide decks available on Google as well. Also, just because the summer season of lectures has finished, you should definitely feel free to reach out to me with any feedback, what you liked, what you didn't like, what you'd like to see. And in the event we do a fall lecture series, if you've got ideas for lectures, you want to present one, or you can think of somebody else who you think might do a good job, definitely reach out to us with that stuff. Other than that, good luck with your Mahjong, and we will see you all later.